Did you know that the last civil war of the Roman Republic started with gossip, city renovations, and a secret will? That's right. We're about to uncover how Mark Antony and Octavian, two men who were supposed to be on the same team, ended up in an all-out political death match, while still smiling for the cameras. And stick around until the end, because the real turning point involves a temple heist, a public relations bombshell, and a queen who became Rome's public enemy #1 without even stepping foot in the city. At first glance, it sounds like an overstatement to say one of the most important wars of antiquity started with awkward tension. But that's exactly what happened. There were no dramatic betrayals on the battlefield, no foreign invasions. The spark that lit the Roman powder keg was ego, spin, and enough passive aggression to fuel an entire season of succession. Mark Antony and Octavian, along with poor sidelined Lepidus, made up the second Triumvirate, basically an uneasy political throuple held together with duct tape and denial. The thing is, the whole arrangement came with an expiration date. And when it ran out, no one wanted to be the first to admit the relationship was dead. You know the type. Couples who still post selfies together even though they'd broken up 3 months ago. While Antony was off in the East, living what looked like a luxurious spin-off series with Cleopatra and handing out kingdoms like he was playing Civilization, Octavian was back in Rome playing the long game. Carefully rebuilding his image, winning public favor, and strategizing with the kind of cold precision that would make even Logan Roy proud. But this wasn't peace. It was a frozen standoff, the kind where no one raises their voice, but you can feel the argument boiling under the surface. The war hadn't started, but it was already too late to stop it. It looked like peace, but wasn't peace. The so-called harmony between Mark Antony and Octavian was more like a ceasefire wrapped in a press release. Rome had barely caught its breath after years of civil war, and here were its two most powerful men pretending everything was fine, while quietly preparing for the next round. Antony had basically relocated to the east, setting up what looked suspiciously like a second Roman court, just with more silk, gold, and Cleopatra. From there, he started playing kingmaker. He handed out territories to his children with Cleopatra like he was modding a save file in The Sims, drawing and redrawing borders with the flair of someone who knew exactly how much it would piss off Rome. Meanwhile, Octavian stayed home. And that was his greatest move. While Antony was building dynasties abroad, Octavian was building something even more powerful, a narrative. He wasn't just controlling Roman politics, but he was curating his public image like a modern-day influencer. Think less general, more campaign manager. He surrounded himself with talent people like Agrippa, played nice with the Senate, and slowly morphed from Caesar's young heir into savior of the Republic. But under all that civility? Pure suspicion. These two didn't trust each other any more than rivals on the Bachelor Trust group date promises. Their silence wasn't peace, but strategic tension. They were smiling through gritted teeth, side-eyeing each other's every move like it was Thanksgiving dinner and someone just brought up politics. Both men knew that the Triumvirate was technically over and the legal term had expired. But admitting that meant one of them would have to blink first, and in Rome, blinking could get you stabbed. So they kept pretending. But while Antony was busy handing out crowns in the east, Octavian had started handing out something else. While Antony was living out his Eastern power fantasy, Octavian had boots on the ground, or more accurately, brooms. And the man with the broom? Marcus Agrippa. Not a soldier at this point, but something even more dangerous, a brilliant bureaucrat with a mission. Agrippa became aedile, a kind of Roman superintendent meets city planner. But instead of just fixing potholes and filing scrolls, he went full SimCity. He launched a public works campaign so sweeping that it practically rebranded the capital overnight. First came the sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's ancient plumbing system, had been neglected for years. Agrippa cleaned it out, expanded it, and made sure the city stopped smelling like, well, empire in decline. Then came the aqueducts. Fresh water started flowing through the city again, which meant more than just hydrated citizens. It meant prestige, stability, and the image of order. And then, the piece de resistance, free public baths. Imagine being an average Roman, sweating in the chaos of daily life, and suddenly the government says, "Hey, want a hot bath?" On us. That wasn't hygiene, but politics. Warm, fragrant, and sudsy politics. Agrippa's work made Octavian look like the guardian of Roman civilization, the guy who cleaned up after chaos and gave the people clean streets and clean skin. All the while, Antony was out east being dramatic with a foreign queen and naming children after the sun and moon. Octavian didn't need to attack Antony directly. All he had to do was make Rome feel normal again. Safer, functional, and comfortable. And when you're giving people working fountains and nice bathrooms, you don't need fiery speeches, just running water. This wasn't just city planning. It was psychological warfare with infrastructure as influence. And while the pipes were getting unclogged, so was public opinion. Because while Rome was getting cleaner, the real war was getting dirtier in letters, whispers, and thinly veiled insults. You know how modern political battles often start on social media, long before anyone casts a vote? Well, in ancient Rome, it started with letters. But don't let the medium fool you. These weren't polite handwritten notes between gentlemen. They were firestorms. The kind of letters that would have gone viral with hashtags like Antony Exposed or Octavian Leaks. The correspondence between Antony and Octavian escalated from formal diplomacy to petty war of words faster than you can say "Dear Sir, go screw yourself." At first, the messages were dressed in protocol, veiled suggestions, passive-aggressive digs, the usual Roman etiquette. But then the gloves came off. Antony accused Octavian of overstepping his authority, of manipulating the Senate, of being a power-hungry boy playing Caesar. Octavian clapped back, hinting that Antony was more Egyptian than Roman now, seduced by Cleopatra and her exotic influence. That, in Roman terms, was code for "you've betrayed your people." It quickly spiraled into a Roman version of a political flame war. Public readings of letters, accusations of drunkenness, laziness, sexual weakness, yes, the classics. Octavian made sure Rome heard it all, while Antony's replies, more defensive and less coordinated, only added fuel to the fire. The people began choosing sides. Senators started whispering. Crowds began murmuring. Even the street graffiti, Rome's ancient Twitter feed, got political. It wasn't just a personal feud anymore. It was two narratives clashing head-on, like dueling press conferences with very pointed subtext. But make no mistake, the words were weapons. Every phrase crafted to wound and every insult calibrated to sway opinion. Octavian, ever the tactician, was winning the war for Rome's imagination. Antony? He was already losing ground, and he hadn't even stepped onto the battlefield. And yet, as explosive as these insults were, nothing, absolutely nothing, would compare to what Octavian did next. So far, Octavian had played the long game. Precise moves, public works, and a few expertly aimed insults. But now he goes full scandal mode. Think, national security breach meets ancient TMZ. The location? The Temple of Vesta, Rome's holiest site, guarded by the Vestal Virgins, whose job was to keep both Rome's sacred flame and its secrets safe. And what does Octavian do? He breaks in. Not with a sword, but with political pressure. He demands access to something locked away inside, Mark Antony's will. That's right, Octavian leaks Antony's last will and testament. And what it contains is the kind of bombshell you'd expect from a major news drop right before an election. First, Antony wants to be buried in Egypt. For a Roman leader, that's like a US senator asking to be buried in Beijing. Then, massive gifts to his children with Cleopatra, kids most of Rome didn't even recognize as legitimate. And finally, a nod to little Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, as a potential heir. And a betrayal of Octavian's entire identity as Caesar's official adopted son. Now picture this, Octavian standing in front of the Roman people, reading this will out loud. It's not just gossip, but a perfectly crafted act of character assassination, disguised as civic duty. Look at this, he says. The man who claims to love Rome is giving away its future to foreigners. And just like that, the narrative flips. Octavian has done something technically illegal, violating sacred space, desecrating a holy trust, but politically? It's genius. He makes Antony look like a traitor, a puppet of the East, a danger to the Roman way of life. Suddenly, everything Antony touches feels un-Roman. And Octavian? He's just the messenger. The very outraged and very convenient messenger. But of course, for every great hero, you need an even greater villain. And Octavian's final masterstroke was realizing Antony was too complicated to hate. Cleopatra, though? She was perfect. Hey, discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you're the kind of person who loves a good story, the real ones, with epic battles, wild mysteries, unforgettable characters, and lessons that still echo today, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore history in a way that's curious, smart, and surprisingly fun. Because understanding the past has never been this interesting. If Antony was too Roman to fully demonize, Cleopatra was the jackpot. For Octavian, she ticked every box of the perfect political villain: foreign, powerful, seductive, and, worst of all, a woman who didn't know her place in the Roman narrative. So, he shifted focus. The war wasn't about Antony anymore. It was about her. Cleopatra became the face of everything Octavian claimed to be saving Rome from: corruption, decadence, and foreign domination. He didn't need to convince Romans to hate Antony. He just had to convince them to fear her. And oh, did he try. The propaganda machine kicked into high gear. Cleopatra was painted as a sorceress queen, a manipulative temptress who had enslaved Antony with her exotic charms and perfumed luxuries. Think, a cross between Cersei Lannister and every femme fatale ever written by insecure Roman senators. Octavian's messaging was clear: Antony didn't betray Rome, she corrupted him. The genius of it? By making Cleopatra the enemy, Octavian gave the war moral weight. This wasn't just about politics. It was about protecting Roman virtue. The idea of a Roman general kneeling to a queen from Egypt? Outrageous, unnatural, and terrifying. But Octavian was here to restore order. He leaned hard into the narrative. Antony was under a spell. Rome was under threat. And the war? It was no longer civil, it was a crusade. A fight to preserve Roman values from a seductive Eastern queen who dared to dream imperial dreams of her own. And this worked brilliantly. Because fear always does. The Senate, once hesitant, rallied. The people, once skeptical, nodded along. The enemy had a name and a face now, and it wore eyeliner and a crown. But what Rome didn't realize was that while they were busy fearing Cleopatra, the war had already begun. Not on the battlefield, but in minds, in speeches, in every whisper passed through the forum. Because by the time swords were drawn, the outcome had already been written. By the time Rome officially declared war, the actual fighting was basically a formality. Octavian had already won where it mattered, in the hearts, minds, and fears of the Roman people. Long before the first oar touched water, he buried Antony's reputation, crowned himself as Rome's moral savior, and turned Cleopatra into a national nightmare. The battlefield? Just a final act in a story he'd already scripted. Antony, on the other hand, was bleeding from every angle, politically, symbolically, strategically. His allies were uncertain. His public image was in shambles. His connection to Caesar had been overshadowed by Cleopatra's influence. And worse, he was physically distant, commanding from the east while Octavian tightened his grip on the west. In military terms, Antony still had ships, soldiers, and one of the most powerful queens in history at his side. But in narrative terms, he was already surrounded. Octavian's genius wasn't just military, it was psychological. He didn't need to defeat Antony on the battlefield to prove his dominance. He just needed Antony to look defeated. He understood something that modern politicians, tech CEOs, and social media strategists still live by: perception is power. If people believe you've already won, half the war is over. And so the stage was set. Not for a battle between equals, but for a carefully choreographed conclusion. Antony had been dragged into a war he couldn't afford to lose and couldn't actually win. Octavian had made sure of that. He'd stacked the deck, rewritten the rules, and edited the trailer to make himself the undisputed protagonist. So now the only thing left was to watch the final act unfold. But that raises a question: if the war was already over before the battle began, why does any of this still matter? So, what did we just witness? Not just a civil war. Not just the fall of Antony, or the rise of Octavian. What we saw was a masterclass in how power really works, not through armies and swords, but through narratives, image, and timing. Antony didn't lose at sea. He lost in Rome, months before Actium, when Octavian framed him as a fallen Roman general seduced by a foreign queen. When the people stopped seeing him as Caesar's heir and started seeing him as a cautionary tale. When senators who once supported him began to shift their chairs, not because of his policies, but because his story no longer worked. Cleopatra didn't bring down Rome, but she became the perfect scapegoat for its transformation. A queen written into the script as a villain so the Republic could justify becoming an empire. And Octavian? He didn't just win a war, but closed the show. He turned civil chaos into imperial order, framed himself as the one who restored Rome, and walked away with a new name: Augustus. The first emperor. The man who buried a republic with a smile and a building program. Sound familiar? Today, leaders still win by defining the conflict before it begins. They shape the enemy. They control the outrage. They leak what needs to be leaked and bury what needs to disappear. They don't need the truth, but the perception of it. Antony lost without losing the battle. And that's what makes his defeat so dangerous, because it reminds us that real wars aren't always fought with weapons. They're fought with words, symbols, or with who gets to tell the story. And Octavian? He made sure he was the one holding the pen.